Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Earthly Headlines. Today we're going to go back 4,500 years back to the Sumerian Empire in southern modern-day Iraq, where this marble pillar with a bunch of cuneiform inscriptions on it was, up until recently, was sitting in the British Museum for about a little over 150 years, just sitting there, because it looked pretty. Until Irving Finkel, who is the curator of the Middle East department of the museum, he deciphered it, and it's a cylindrical marble pillar that was sitting in what was called no man's land, and that term no man's land actually was used in the rough translation on the cuneiform tablet itself, or the pillar itself. It was put there to mark the border between the warring states of Lagash and Umma. So here's a map, just so you guys can get a look. So here's a CAD here next to the Euphrates in the northeast, and then when you go south, you see Umma, and then downstream this river is Lagash. And these two city-states were at war with each other for a while, until I think Umma finally destroyed Lagash and took over their land. They were disputing over a fertile area called Guadina, or the edge of the plain. I love the names that they have, by the way. The edge of the plain, no man's land. Those are really cool terms that were translated from the tablets themselves and the pillars. Around 2400 BC, Enmetina, I'm going to start name dropping a little bit. So Enmetina is the king of Lagash. He had the pillar erected to stake his claim, so to speak. This is all, in reality, who knows exactly why he had it erected. I mean, these are conclusions based on all the available evidence. I mean, maybe in reality it was a little bit different, but for the most part, they believe this to be true. So this pillar that was erected became the earliest written evidence of a border dispute. Now, is it the first ever border dispute? Probably not. But this is the first ever etched in the archaeological record, etched on a pretty beautiful looking pillar. The king of Umma is named Gisha-Kidu. So Gisha-Kidu and Enmetina were sworn enemies. And Enmetina also had a ceremonial mace head on display, and he also was responsible for something called the Ur plaque, and basically illustrates an offering that he made at the border shrine. Allegedly, this is according to the museum. They think that in its heyday, the marble pillar would have glistened off of the sun and would have stood out like a sore thumb, so to speak, for everyone to see, with the sun's rays beating down on the plain. Similar things have been said about the pyramids as well. When the pyramids were covered in beautiful limestone, that the sun must have made it look brilliant with dead reckoning if you were there right next to it. So, like I mentioned earlier, it's a heavily inscribed object. It tells the complete story of the war between the two cities over the land. Whoever chiseled the pillar didn't just take pains to emphasize the name of Lagash god Ningirsu. They also threw some shade, so to speak, at the rival god of Umma. And how they did that was they wrote the god's name in a messy, almost illegible script, much distinctly different from the script they were using when they were talking about the Lagash god, which is an interesting detail that they caught. And that is kind of a sort of stab at the enemy. So it must have been a biased account, because the person who chiseled the pillar must have been on the Lagash side of the dispute, because it was there. First of all, it was there, and secondly, it tells the story of the rivalry between the two. And I think it was probably biased to begin with, because of the nature of how, according to the translation, of how it was presented, how the story was presented. Finkel says, you have in one breath the use of writing in a magical way to enhance the power of one deity and then nullify the power of the other. This is unique in cuneiform. So people were talking smack on each other since time immemorial. And since writing was invented, they continued that tradition. So, I mean, that shouldn't surprise anybody at all. Finkel believes the pillar was artificially aged by a scribe to improve Lagash's historical claim to Guadina. Now, this is where it gets a little bit deep, and it might be, again, I'm not privy to the actual details as to why he came to these conclusions, but it appears the scribe used an archaic form of cuneiform to make the pillar seem older than it actually was, which made the modern interpretation effort difficult. So, as an analogy, maybe that's like writing the U.S. Constitution in like old Middle English or something like that to make it seem like the Constitution was written 800 years or so before it was actually written. And that's an interesting, if that's true, then that's really interesting and pretty cunning on the part of the Lagashi scribe. Just a little bit more background between the two city-states. The fight between Umma and Lagash is one of the oldest known wars in human history. And one of the oldest legal documents is the Treaty of the Misalim, signed around 2550 BC. So 4,570 some odd years ago. They demarcated the border with the stele along an irrigation canal. So they were pretty fond of putting up these monolithic inscriptions and pillars once something big happened. But, the peace didn't last, and then 100 years or so later, the war between the two kings, Enmetina and Gishikidu, took place, and the boundary was reaffirmed, and Umma successfully destroyed the capital city of the Lagash. And then later on, Sargon took over all of Mesopotamia, and the boundary stones didn't mean anything to him. He just took everything over and made everything one country. That's the story of this pillar, and you can see this is sideways, I think, and then this part on the right was probably in the ground. I think more than likely they did this because probably someone further along, deeper into history, the further you go back, some other country probably did the same thing. I don't think they were the first, although it was the first, again, in the record. Leave some comments about this if you guys know a lot about Sumerian history or cuneiform, the language. If you guys know anything else about this translation, I couldn't find any more detailed analysis on exactly what the transcription process was in this case and why he came to the conclusions he did. The only thing we get are his conclusions here. We know that for instance, they wrote the rival god of Umma in a messy, illegible script, but maybe there's another reason for that. Maybe it wasn't supposedly a disrespectful thing, although most likely it probably is, but who knows? We don't know, right? Speaking of comments, I had this one comment, I think it was on YouTube, I don't think it was on BitChute. Someone mentioned if we would be able to find traces of ethical veganism in the future. Would that become like a category or some sort of demarcation of some archaeological find or a dig? And you know what? Maybe thousands of years from now, they might dig somebody up from the ruins of Los Angeles, and they'll see, maybe they'll be able to find, this guy was a vegan, and because he ate this, and this, and he didn't eat anything else, and maybe they could go through his dental records. As far as an ethical choice, maybe if they find a journal or something like that. But as far as people in the past that we find now, I don't know if ethical veganism was a large enough thing to find traces of. I feel like people in the ancient times, they just ate what was available, and something like animal rights. Although in ancient India, there were some animals like the cow that were held sacred, and some other animals that shouldn't have been, that they strongly advise not to eat, like shellfish. And I think dogs, although in some countries dogs were fair game. Maybe there were people who ate they were vegetarians and they lived off the vegetation. But I don't know if there were ethical vegans in ancient times. So I don't know. I thought that was a good question. Maybe there will be, but they'd have to find a diary or some sort of inscription or go through, again, like I mentioned earlier, dental records to see exactly what they're eating. Maybe find an intact, they'd have to find an intact ethical vegan with stuff in their stomach to really get to the bottom of that. And even then, maybe that would be a stretch. But anyway, I thought that was a good question, and it was in the comment section of the last video I did yesterday. So let me know what you guys think about this Sumerian tablet or this pillar here, and anything about the language, or maybe some discoveries that are akin to this one about marking border markers. I think that's a pretty cool idea. It kind of pays tribute to the people who died in the war, right? You're kind of educating somebody. If you're, let's say, if you're a passerby in southern ancient Iraq, and you're going from Lagash territory to Umma territory, and then you come across this pillar. Yeah, you're educating the masses, so to speak, a little bit. Even though that account seemed to be a little bit biased, they're still getting information. So let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.